So Shogun is a thing, and it's just a little bit the best thing I have seen this year. Mind, I'm a bit behind on my watching, because grad school consumed my life. But since coursework has ended, thank goodness, I'm slowly trying to catch up on my watch list, and Shogun was at the top, and I totally understand why. This show, or a miniseries or whatever, is somehow intimate and epic at the same time. The politics at play and the way that every character's actions have huge ramifications over the course of the story was enthralling. There were moments where I had no idea what was going to happen and I was left blindsided by the outcome, and other moments when I was certain I knew what was going on but was dumbfounded by characters' actions. I loved feeling the suspense of not knowing what was going to occur. It's not often anymore that a show or movie can consistently keep me guessing because of its masterful writing rather than superfluous plot twists. I'm looking at you, Riverdale. But this show was brimming with clever characters, each of them trying to outmaneuver the other. In fact, my only complaint was the lack of big battles. But there were enough small, intense fights that I only noticed this upon reflection, and I don't know that they would have fit the character-driven drama the show was going for anyway. I had never heard of Shogun before starting the series, so the drama unfolding on screen was brand new to me. It wasn't until I started discussing the show with others that I was told it was based on a book, and it happened to be my mom's favorite book when she was a young adult. However, I was familiar with a bit of Japanese history, so I understood why these specific years were so important and what was happening or going to happen in Japan at the time. Thank you, Bill Wirtz. Once I was a few episodes into the show, it was a little easier to tell what the scope of the story being told was. But this did cause me to wonder, if the show and the book are based on real-world history, why tell the story using fictional characters? Historical recreations are not new in the world of television and tend to do pretty well, so what's the point of a fictional adaptation? But this decision makes sense when you realize who the main character of the show is, the purpose of historical fiction, and the fact that the show is actually not really all that concerned with historical accuracy anyway. And I know that was a bold statement, and it sounds awful, and I know that this show was meticulously crafted down to the tiniest detail, which is why that last statement sounds like a straight-up falsehood, but hear me out on this, because it's the last point that makes this show even more genius than you think it is. And so today, I want to talk about Shogun. As I alluded to, Shogun was originally a book by author James Clavell. While serving as a soldier in World War II, Clavell was sent to fight on the Pacific Front, but was captured and sent to a prison in Japanese-occupied Singapore. After the war, Clavell moved to the States and began screenwriting for Hollywood, but could never let go of the horrors of prison. After writing a few hits, including the absolute classic horror movie The Fly, Clavell decided to write a novel based on his time in prison. This first novel was called King Rat, and was quickly turned into a movie. Despite King Rat being based on his own experiences, the story was historical fiction, which meant that when Clavell tackled his next book, he spent time researching. Citation was released in 1966 to critical acclaim. This prompted Clavell to shift focus from screenplays to novel writing. He followed up Citation with arguably his most famous book, Shogun, in 1975. One of the reasons Shogun is so well remembered is because of the success of the miniseries. That's right, Shogun has actually been adapted into a miniseries once before. Clavell was heavily involved in the creation of this first series, and it has a lot of things going for it, and it remains one of the largest Western productions ever to be filmed in Japan. The whole thing feels a little 80s, if you know what I mean. But I'm told it was a big deal at the time, which further propelled the notoriety of the book and its position as Clavell's best-known work. Unfortunately, despite its very warm reception in the West, critics and audiences in Japan hated it. Maybe it's the fact that the whole thing was created by white people. In 2018, it was announced that FX was interested in producing Shogun as a miniseries, and the show was picked up and began filming the year after in the UK. However, the executives at FX did not feel like production was of a high enough quality and retooled the entire show. Shogun was given an entirely new writing and producing team. Luckily, they were able to hold on to the incredible Hiroyuki Sanada, who served as producer, actor, and everything doer for the show. If you don't know who this man is, I guarantee you've seen something he has been in. He is truly an incredible actor and deserves way more praise in the West. This new production was shot in Vancouver, Canada, which holds a very strong resemblance to Japan, and a lot of the production crew were brought over from Japan to give credence and authenticity to this story. Due to the whole reshoot, the show was not released until early 2024, but was met with great praise by both Western and Japanese audiences alike, who lauded the masterful storytelling, attention to detail, and amazing acting. You know, because of Hiroyuki Sanada. Also Anasawa, Cosmo Jarvis, and Tadanobu Asano, but you know, Hiroyuki Sanada. The show ran for 10 episodes and was released weekly on FX, which is also included on Disney+, because of course Disney has their greedy hands all over this. In case you haven't seen the show yet and are interested in doing so, this is your spoiler warning. The ruler of Japan, or Taiko, was on his deathbed and created a council of 5 of his most trusted advisors. but really just 4 of the most politically powerful dudes in Japan and 1 bureaucrat. He trusted these men to look after the country until the young emperor was old enough to take the throne. In 1600, a Dutch ship finds its way to the shores of Japan, where the crew are immediately taken prisoner. Among them is an English pilot named John Blackthorne. Unfortunately, diplomatic negotiations do not go particularly well.
Tell this poxy little bastard I piss on his whole damn country!
The English sure do know how to charm native peoples, don't they? Ajiro village is ruled over by a daimyo, or lord by the name of Yabashige, who wants nothing more than to gain power for himself and his family. Thinking that the ship and its guns will further his cause and protect him in the now politically precarious Japan, Yabashige takes the cannons and contents of the Dutch vessel for himself. Unfortunately for Yabashige, his lord, Yoshi Toranaga, gets word that a foreign ship has arrived and has his own plans for it. Toranaga is one of the 5 regents and is very popular amongst the political powers in Japan. But that bureaucrat that I mentioned earlier, Ishido, doesn't like that Toranaga is so popular and plots to undermine Toranaga's place on the council. One of the ways Ishido keeps power is by keeping members of the ruling families as guests inside the castle in Osaka, but orders that others are not allowed to do the same in their castles. Because of this, tension is rising between the council led by Ishido, who opposes Toranaga. Toranaga decides that the addition of cannons would be very beneficial and decides that Blackthorne might be useful after all, and negotiates with him. Unfortunately, Blackthorne doesn't speak Japanese, and so Lady Mariko is assigned to Blackthorne as interpreter.
You will please address me as Mariko-sama.
Blackthorne explains the reason he is in Japan is to stop the Portuguese, who are Catholics, from benefiting from Japan's wealth and seeks to remove Catholic influence in Japan. What he also reveals is that the Portuguese, who have stated that they are only in Japan to spread peace and Christianity, are in fact much more malicious and want to replace Japan's leaders with Catholic ones. To do this, they've set up a base in Macau where they planned and funded an uprising against the Taiko before he died. And they did this because the Spanish and Portuguese split up the world and Portugal was allowed to do whatever they want with Japan.
誠にポルトガル領と申したのか。
はい、そのように。
Toranaga is not impressed and agrees to a tentative agreement with Blackthorne, who will train Toranaga's men in cannon warfare. Blackthorne is then sent back to Ajiro accompanied by Mariko. While there, he struggles to learn the language, customs, and culture of the Japanese people. In particular, he struggles to understand Mariko, who is a devout Catholic but also thoroughly Japanese. She wants to commit suicide because of the dishonor her father brought on her family, but cannot as long as Toranaga wishes her alive. Despite Blackthorne's lack of understanding, he begins to grow close with Mariko, which raises the suspicions of Mariko's husband. In an attempt to grow his army, Toranaga asks his brother Nobutatsu for an alliance, only to be betrayed as his brother has replaced him on the council. In retaliation, Toranaga's son attempts to kill Nobutatsu, only to slip and crack his skull. Did not see that one coming. Toranaga is now in mourning and loses all his will to fight. With no way to secure his safety against Catholic pursuit, Blackthorne teams up with Yabashige, who is actually planning on selling Blackthorne out to Ishido, who he's been working with as a double agent while also serving Toranaga. But when Lady Mariko shows up, everything goes sideways, as she's now being held as a guest in the castle, but was given orders by Toranaga to return to him immediately. If she is not allowed to leave, then all the ruling families will have reason to revolt openly, as their family members have been taken hostage. But if she is allowed to leave, then Ishido has no bargaining power or control. In the end, Mariko is given permission to leave, but under Ishido's orders, Yabashige allows shinobi into the castle to chase down Mariko and members of Toranaga's family. In the end, Mariko sacrifices herself to save them and Blackthorne. Blackthorne returns to Ajiro heartbroken and confesses that he was just trying to use Toranaga the same way the Portuguese were, but Toranaga forces Blackthorne to work for him, ordering him to rebuild his ship. He also orders that Yabashige commit seppuku, and when the sun sets on Yabashige's last day, Toranaga explains that all of this was part of his plan. Toranaga knew that Yabashige was a double agent, he knew Lady Mariko wanted to die and made her death meaningful, and he even knew she cared for Blackthorne and would negotiate his safety with the Portuguese. He also had Blackthorne's ship scuttled in order to force him to stay in Japan. Everything down to the last detail was part of Toranaga's plan to show the council that they had no power. Lady Mariko's death puts a damper on many people's plans for war, meaning Toranaga will have a clean shot at becoming the military ruler of Japan, the Shogun. Of course, I'm missing a lot of details and I probably spent way too much time on the history, but the show is 10 episodes long and they're each like an hour. You could have cut me some slack. Setting up a character is crucial to the narrative. How you do this is important in any medium, but in film there are a few ways to do this effectively. As a general rule of thumb, usually the first person on screen is an important character, if not the main character. Sometimes they are the villain, and occasionally in fantasy movies they love their long epilogues in the form of prophecies. And when this happens, you can fall back on the second rule, which is that the first real line of on-screen dialogue indicates the main character. Not any written text or voiceover, but the first on-screen spoken line. But in Shogun, it is very clear who the main character is. The first character on screen and the first character to have on-screen dialogue is John Blackthorne. It is from this point on that we follow his story throughout his time in Japan. The other main characters are Toranaga and Mariko, but Toranaga isn't introduced until 10 minutes in, and Mariko isn't introduced until 22 minutes after Ishido, Hiromatsu, and Yabushige's nephew Omi. Conventional storytelling would dictate that, in order of importance, Blackthorne is first, followed by Toranaga, and then Mariko. And this is sort of true, although there are long swaths where Toranaga is not present, and an entire episode where he does not appear at all. But this is all a very clever deception. If you pay attention, the credits give this deception away, as Hiroyuki Sanada is credited first, despite the fact that Cosmo Jarvis as Blackthorne has significantly more screen time and lines. This deception is important because we, the audience, are kept in the dark as to what Toranaga's plans are, just as much as his enemies and even his closest advisors. I'm still reeling over Hiromatsu's death. Because he is not the main character, we have very little insight into what he is up to. We know it's something. He's said to be a brilliant tactician, but there's doubt sown there. If he was the main character, it would be too easy to know what he was up to, and all the suspense would be lost. So the show follows Blackthorne as he attempts to find a way to survive in a foreign land, with or without Toranaga's help. However, once he returns to Toranaga's side, Blackthorne realizes just how out of his depth he and everyone else is. He was played just as much as Ishido.
Toranaga will be dead in weeks.
Then you don't know Yoshi Toranaga.
The revelation for Blackthorne is important, and it's only a guess as Toranaga only revealed his plans to the now dead Yabushige. The finale shows the audience that Toranaga is really the main character of the story, but it's told to us through Blackthorne's perspective. The reveal of Toranaga's deceptions only worked and led to this point because we had no knowledge, which is a powerful storytelling tool, but there's a reason that Blackthorne makes sense as the main character, other than the narrative one, because it has to do with who the show and book are aimed at, which is white audiences. Characters act as the perspective for a story to unfold. That makes it imperative that audiences sympathize with the main character, but Blackthorne is not an overly good dude.
Go your shell and fuck yourself, you sniveling little shitbag.
But he is white and European, and more importantly for general audiences in the West, he doesn't speak Japanese. And this is one of the brilliant points of Shogun, because the vast majority of the dialogue is in Japanese. We, the audience, have the benefit of subtitles, but that still does not give us full insight into the nuances of the language, assuming you're not fluent in Japanese. Blackthorne makes for an excellent stand-in for non-Japanese audiences to sympathize with because he can ask questions about culture and customs as a stand-in for the audience. This is an easy way to introduce information to readers, but in historical fiction, it's also useful for cluing in those who are unfamiliar with this particular period in Japan's history. It's useful to see Blackthorne bumble his way through everything, slowly picking up bits of information, because that's precisely how the audience probably feels. It's a good storytelling technique, as the audience doesn't feel like they're being spoken down to for the sake of understanding, and Japanese audiences are more forgiving as there's an in-world reason for explanations. So, despite not being the main character of the story, Blackthorne being the protagonist or focal point works for the unfolding of the story and for bringing in non-Japanese audiences. And it's this second feature that leads me to my next point. Considering who the primary audience is makes a big difference in who and how you present the story. But in the case of Shogun, this is even more crucial because it's historical fiction. As a genre, historical fiction has often been frowned upon. It seems to sit in this weird space between history and fiction or fantasy, but it belongs to neither. But fiction and history have a weird incestuous past. Before the advent of positivism and true historiosity, the stories of the far past were fiction, but were considered to have the same importance as history. Think of the way the Romans considered the Iliad and Odyssey to be stories depicting the eventual creation of Rome. Nowadays, we tend to give history more credit than fiction, but the truth is that when we look at the facts of what actually happened in the past, we know very little, and thus imagination is used to fill in the gaps. Now, this fiction is based on educated guesses, plausibility, and factual evidence, but I could use the same description for historical fiction. And the further back you go, the more gaps there are in need of filling. Oh, I need to work on my phrasing.
It means...
Thank you, I understand the metaphor. I've just never heard it put so poetically.
What makes historical fiction so powerful is that unlike strict history, which is about events that happened to people, historical fiction introduces readers to those people as characters and then shows how they might have lived or reacted to events. And as I stated, the characters are a vehicle for the audience that guides them through the story. Historical fiction brings historical events alive for people because it makes the places and events come alive. Audiences do not connect to history just because it informs the present. They connect to it because a character, real or otherwise, that they empathize with moves through the historical event. The goal of historical fiction is to bring someone into a time period or specific event and breathe life into that history for the reader. In this way, historical fiction, while sometimes inaccurate, can be a more effective way to teach actual history because it emphasizes the story in history and transforms the dates on the calendar into real events that real humans experienced. Okay, now we can get to the controversial bit, which actually isn't really all that controversial at all. And I had to set up the other stuff because it was important to understand why Blackthorn is the main character, and that the show uses Blackthorn as a surrogate to get the audience into the world of Shogun. Blackthorn is a stroke of genius as a fictional character for all the reasons I stated above, but he's actually not the only fictional character. Mariko and even Toranaga are both fictional. In fact, there's not a single real-world character in this entire show, and that's what I'm getting at when I say the show is not concerned with historical accuracy, at least not in the narrative. This dope history and fiction scholar named Laura Saxton posits a really niche but important distinction. Saxton rightly points out that the words accuracy and authenticity have been used synonymously in regards to historical fiction when questions about exactness come up in comparison to history. Instead, Saxton wants to make the distinction between accuracy, or how well the fiction in question directly presents the actual events and characters of history, and authenticity, which is how well the fiction presents what the audience perceives to be accurate. And it is the second point that I'm interested in. Shogun doesn't really have anything in the way of accuracy in regards to actual events and characters that took place, but it is supremely crafted when it comes to the authenticity of the time period and what that probably looked like. The characters in Shogun are all fictional, but they're all heavily based on real-world people. Not all of them would have met or interacted in this way, but all of them are based on real people, including Blackthorn. This means that the story cannot be truly accurate, but that's fine because trying to get accuracy right in recreation of historical events is always going to be tricky. So instead, Shogun uses its fictional characters and events to tell a kind of parallel history to the rise of Tokugawa Ieyasu, who Toranaga is a stand-in for. So there's truth in the fiction, but how and what and who does not have to be particularly accurate. And in its place, the show can make the setting, culture, and customs incredibly accurate by focusing on the authenticity of how the story is depicted. This is Shogun's secret weapon because the attention to detail is astounding in this show. The costumes are breathtaking, right down to the wigs. They even hired movement coaches to make sure that the bowing and walking was done properly and that poor people walked and looked different compared to the wealthy, and that there are distinctions between men and women. If you haven't seen any of the behind the scenes stuff, I highly recommend it because this attention to detail is unrivaled by any show I've ever seen. The point was to make it look and feel as though everything was period accurate, because Shogun was never about trying to depict what actually happened, but what it would have looked like to live, eat, and breathe in that time period. Let me give you an example. There's a scene where Blackthorn explains how he came to Japan in front of Toranaga, Yabushige, and the other lords, which is translated by Mariko. Again, none of the characters here are real, and the actual historical characters probably did not have any of these kinds of relationships, but the events they're speaking about are true. What's more is the act of translation is an important part of the drama, as Mariko comes to grips with the truth of what Blackthorn is saying and her feelings about her faith.
This is a lie.
No.
Do you swear by your god?
Yes, I do.
The characters are used as a medium to tell the story and history. The drama is personal and fictional, but the Spanish and Portuguese did actually divide the world up in the Treaty of Tordesillas. And then we see Toranaga's contempt for the Portuguese as arrogance, which foreshadows the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate, where no trade was permitted in Japan and Christianity was repressed. Martin Scorsese's Silence is actually directly about this and takes place right after Shogun ends, so if you're interested, it's a brilliant movie. This scene is maybe 5 minutes total, but it's a brilliant mashup of the fictional interpersonal drama with historical facts that informed the current and future politics and religion of Japan. And it's these details around the fictional narrative that made this adaptation of Shogun so lifelike. No questions asked, Shogun is going to be on my list of top stuff for this year. I still have a lot to catch up on, but Shogun's masterful storytelling hooked me from the start, and the fact that it doesn't pull any punches when telling a brutal version of Japan's history is fascinating. But it really is in the details that the show shines. Don't get me wrong, the acting is superb, but it's because the characters were coached through actions, ceremonies, fighting styles, stances, and dialogue that push this to the absolute peak of historical fiction. And it's really just a damn good show by any account. But the details mean that the show achieves a level of authenticity that is truly spectacular. This presentation of historical fiction leads audiences through the time period, and it does what historical fiction does best, which is get those who are unaware invested in the actual story and events that occurred in Japan at the time. Reading about the lives of the real-world counterparts of the characters unlocks a little part of history of another country, and hopefully aids in the visualization of historical events during the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate in the 1600s. The show was never about historical accuracy, but about authenticity by depicting a kind of truth through fiction. And that is why Shogun is an authentic and powerful historical fiction. Here are my stray thoughts. I really enjoyed that most of the dialogue was in Japanese, and it definitely made the world feel more realistic. I still would have liked to have seen the battle mentioned in the last episode, but I understand that we needed a break after losing Mariko. That was a loss I did not expect after the subversion of her suicide. I focused a lot on Blackthorn because of the importance of historical fiction, but I also loved Fuji, and I thought that her arc and friendship with Blackthorn was really sweet. Ana Sawai as Mariko was phenomenal, and probably would have been the standout performance if not for Hiroyuki Sanada, who is a legend. Go look up that dude's filmography. If you haven't seen anything on it, pick something and watch it, because you're not going to be disappointed. Hey! Thanks so much for watching that episode. I'm back now, grad school is over, or at least coursework is, so I'll try and get videos out a little bit more consistently, but bear with me because I still have to write a whole thesis. This show was a lot of fun, it is absolutely fantastic, definitely go and watch it, and if you enjoyed it, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe because I got lots more cool ideas coming down, and I really miss doing this, so all that's happening right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.